An Archaeodeath publication review.
Hello, I'm Professor Howard Williams and I write on the Archaeodeath blog, and I thought I'd bring this video to you about one of my publications. The Archaeology of Death, Burial and Commemoration is a complex and multi-period themed aspect of modern research in archaeology, and as part of that we explore not only the field investigation of funerary remains from earliest prehistory to recent times, but also we consider the ethics and museum and heritage dimensions of the way we engage with the dead and display the dead. And a recent publication of mine addressed that issue. I co-edited with Dr. Melanie Giles of the University of Manchester a book called Archaeologists and the Dead, which is available through Oxford University Press, and is a hardback book still 4 years after its publication to the month. And therefore I must say that while I'm very proud of the book, it remains largely inaccessible, with a retail price in the UK of over £100. And so I thought this video would be the first of a series which introduce you to some of my publications and explain the context. When I say my publications, I'm talking here really about collaborative work, both in terms of co-editing and in terms of working with a whole series of authors from around the world to publish some of the latest ideas and thinking and disseminate knowledge about our research on mortuary archaeology, the archaeology of death, burial and commemoration. So in that regard, the book is a bit like any academic book. It has a short print run, a high price tag, and it might not be widely read. But I've been recently aware through my teaching, preparations for my latest round of teaching, which during the COVID-19 lockdown has been largely via video link, that my students and also other academics haven't read this book, and many of the ideas within it remain cutting edge and not fully debated and addressed within the wider academic circles. And I think there's a lot of, should we say, some of the more recent books coming out haven't tackled some of the ideas that we have developed in this book. So I thought I would use this first video of a series that review recent research to tackle archaeologists and the dead. And what better during a lockdown but to do my morning exercise and come out to my local churchyard to present you this video. So let's see how this goes. Now I won't review every chapter in the book, but this is quite a substantial book of almost 500 pages. It's 465 pages including the index. And there's an introduction by Melanie and myself where we called Introduction to Mortuary Archaeology in Contemporary Society, where we, I think for the first time, sketch out the many intersections between archaeologists digging the dead and studying ancient funerary practices and our contemporary world, foregrounding heritage practitioners and archaeologists as we call it, death dealers or mediators of mortality. We're not undertakers, we're not specialists in mourning and bereavement, but we are, through our work, constantly and repeatedly engaging people with death at a safe distance. Death of others, death of people long ago, death of thousands upon thousands of human lives lived and funerals conducted and depositions made where we don't even know their names in many cases. And we, in this introduction, try to frame our research as archaeologists within that broader interdisciplinary framework and actually broader social context in the early 21st century. So we review previous work looking at the archaeology of death and burial and the ethics and the growth of the decolonisation debate and from NAGPRO in the 1990s onwards, and the different ways in which we as archaeologists working in very different contexts around the world, increasingly dealing with a whole variety of different stakeholder communities, facilitating reburial in local areas where excavations take place, or repatriation when we're dealing with collections in museums. That's a huge massive area of debate that has received a solid and sustained amount of research and ongoing debate. But we put that into other contexts too, and we look at particularly the UK museums and the crisis in burial archaeology at the beginning of the last decade, and debating the work of Mike Pitts and Duncan Sayer, Mike Parker Pearson and Tiffany Jenkins, and about the whole crisis in confidence about museums and archaeologists, about should we be doing this, can we do this, how do we do this in a responsible way that respects both past people and present day communities of all manner. We then take it on some particular issues in the introduction to Archaeologists and the Dead. We look at the issue of naming the dead, both nicknames and attributing historical personages to the funerary remains we uncover, from Tutankhamun to the excavation of Richard III of England. We tackle the ethical problems and challenges with that engagement with past personalities. One of those powerful ways we can draw and engage people in mortality, past and present, is through the individual, particularly in a society such as ours, where the individual is sort of valued and valorized in many ways. And yet with that comes a whole series of problems and neglect for the unnamed dead and the stories of those who do not have ancestors surviving, who we still have a responsibility to tell their stories. So we address the issue of the naming the dead and the plurality of identities that we find in the archaeological record, often not as intact human bodies. We find them as traces, fragments, disturbed graves that have been long damaged by animal burrowing, by biochemical processes in the soil, by the fact that archaeologists are often excavating graves that have been damaged by later activity, by medieval ploughing or modern construction, or by the digging of subsequent graves. And we also deal with the fact that many funerary processes in the past were multi-staged and involved the deliberate breaking down of the body through separation of parts, disarticulation by re-entering tombs and rearranging bones, or indeed a widespread practice in the human past, cremation in different forms, burning the dead. So we try to sort of suggest that actually archaeologists have perhaps focused too much of their attention on certain categories of past human remains and discussing the ethics of those. And in particular, I'm thinking here about mummies and bog bodies, which are very special because of the high level of preservation in desiccated conditions or in waterlogged conditions. You know, they haven't broken down. We can see faces with skin and hair, and we can see the fingerprints and the fingernails and the details of their stomach contents. You know, we can get access to so much rich information, and they are very special and exceptional categories. But perhaps we've neglected, we focused on the ethics of those to the detriment of thinking about the many hundreds of thousands of human remains that are excavated, where we're dealing with skeletonized material, but often heavily fragmented and burnt, distorted and reduced in size. And the stories of those people we have a responsibility to tell too. And we talked about how actually some of the most powerful stories we can tell about the dead are actually from when we never find their bodies at all. Cenotaphs, gravestones, and indeed there are many cases of very lavish and high status funerals from the human past where we never found the body. And perhaps the most evocative for the British Isles, our richest grave ever found, the Mound 1 Sutton Hoo treasure that sits in the British Museum for all to see. No body survived, and there had been some speculation about whether there ever had been a body, but phosphate analysis of the area in the centre of the chamber suggests there had been a body, but the acidic soil conditions meant that even the bones had been eaten away. And we talked about this plurality of identities that we must tell, and the role of the archaeologists in telling tales. That's our role as archaeologists. We're mediators and storytellers with the past, and often that is overlooked in our quest to define ourselves as scientists, regaling facts and detailed processes, that we are at the end of the day a form of mediator about not only past societies but also our own mortality. And in that regard we call for in the paper greater and ongoing dialogue with a range of other disciplines, from literary scholars to sociologists, as well as with scientists, to reconstruct not only the stories of past lives and how they died, but the communities and the broader sweep of human history, which is what archaeologists are best at narrating. So from the individual story right up to the grand narrative, to use the dead in a responsible and respectful way to tell stories that matter to people today. Not only people who claim to be ancestrally linked to past populations, but also to communities who may not have identities rooted in one place or in one community, so in one past culture. So I think we have an exciting and unique job as an archaeologist to mediate with these stories about the past, but also about what it means to be human, what it means to be mortal, and what it means to sort of remember the dead and commemorate the dead, but also to forget, to move on, to adapt to new circumstances. So the introduction to our book tries to set up a whole host of recent researchers who then move forward in their individual chapters and individual ways to explore the archaeology of death in the present, how we practice funerary archaeology through our field investigations, through our museum curation and display, and through our liaisons with other communities, our work with artists, our dialogues with contemporary funeral practices and media, and indeed the concluding reflections on the book by expert and veteran mortuary archaeologist Lynn Goldstein really put the book into a broader context. Now, chapter 20, reflections on intersections of mortuary archaeology and contemporary society, overviews the book adeptly, and given her lifelong experience as a practitioner, a field practitioner and academic researcher, Lynn is able to pull together many of the themes and push for a future where we respect and value the dead, stakeholder communities, but critically evaluate our broader significance in society through whether it's through evaluating the way that the media appropriate and take forward our stories and communicate, whether it's about looking at TV shows and how they portray archaeologists. Also, it's about how we work with museums and communities. Also, it's about how we do our field work. So I give to you a visual of archaeologists and the dead, and I will come back in a subsequent video and talk about my contribution to this book. I don't want to overview and speak for others and all their other chapters, but I would say that through those sections looking at field work, there's a detailed section of chapters looking at field investigations, and I want to shout out the 6 papers by Sean Anthony looking at contemporary excavation ahead of construction in Denmark, in Copenhagen. We have John McClelland and Jessica Soretso-Roman looking at the US situation with osteological practice as a form of re-embodiment. We have Ulla Riala, who's a Finnish archaeologist but has worked a lot in Italy, who did a survey of archaeologists' attitudes to the dead. We have Andrew Pearson and Ben Jeff, who did really amazing work on St Helena, excavating the graves of the liberated African graveyard there. And also Martin Brown, looking at First World War casualties and senses of ownership of the dead, as well as Faye Sayer and Duncan Sayer with Bones Without Barriers, investigating the social impact of digging the dead. Then we have a whole section of 7 chapters on museums by Hedley Swain, Sarah Tatum, Nina Nordstrom, Karen Excel, Tiffany Jenkins, Liv Nielsen Stutz and myself, looking at different aspects of museum display. And then the final section with chapters on pagans and study of ancestors by William Rathouse, looking at Austrian perceptions of the dead by Estella Weiss-Cracy, a chapter by Duncan Sayer and Tony Walter looking at digging the dead in the digital age. Trevor Kirk addresses writing and how we write creatively using mortuary remains, and Melanie Giles reconstructing death. She looks at envisioning death and the dead in Iron Age chariot burials, so she looks at how we visualise the dead in museums and our publications. So together it's an action-packed book of death in the present and how our archaeological practice and archaeological theories interact with each other and with broader contemporary society. And I'll come back for a second video where I tell you a little bit more about my contribution to this book. So you can read more about my work on my WordPress blog, Archaeodeath, and I'll put in the descriptor below information about some of my other publications that you can learn about. But I hope this was an information-packed video that gives you an introduction to a book that still, I'm afraid, is a little bit out of the price range of most people, but at least it makes you aware of it, and in terms of library access, and in terms of maybe you could order one for your academic or local library, and maybe you can look on my academia.edu site where I have uploaded some of my work, so you can read about some of the work, and some of the authors in this book have also uploaded their author accepted versions, or draft versions of their papers in various locations. So it is partially accessible in that via that sort of informal digital media too. So thank you very much for your time.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to Howard Williams on YouTube. In addition, consider following the Archaeodeath WordPress blog at howardwilliamsblog.wordpress.com.